So it's the top of the hour, and I think we can go ahead and get started. I can see that people are joining us, and I'm delighted to welcome everyone to this World Affairs program. My name is Carla Thorson, and for those of you who have participated in other virtual programs that we've done, you'll see that this one looks just a little bit different. We are giving everyone an opportunity to engage a bit more in the discussion. But for the initial part of the program, we would ask that you please keep your video off and your microphones muted, both to preserve bandwidth and also to reduce the possibility of lots of noise and things in the background. But later in the program, we're going to give everyone an opportunity to move into smaller groups and have a conversation with one of our panelists. And we are really delighted to have a very interesting group of community activists here in the Bay Area. And our host, Ezra David Romero from KQED, here to talk about rising waters in the Bay Area and what communities are doing to take on this challenge. So this is part of an ongoing series that World Affairs is doing, World Affairs in Action. And the objective is to connect you to global challenges and give you an opportunity to take actions yourself to address them. So what we hope to do is to leave you with some tools so that you can be a part of local solutions. After the program today, we'll be sending everyone some more information about ways that they can get more engaged. And we're really looking forward to the group of people we've invited today to share with us the things that they're doing with their communities and how you can get involved. And with that, I'd like to introduce our host, Ezra David Romero, who is a climate reporter at KQED, and he covers the absence and excess of water in the Bay Area. So think sea level rise, flooding, and drought, all things that we are very much focused on. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Ezra, so you can introduce our guests.
Thanks, Carla. It's really nice to be here. I know I've been covering climate for about almost 10 years in California, first in Fresno for 5.5 years. That started when there was the drought. That drought from 2011 to 2017, that's where I sort of jumped into climate reporting because that's what was happening all around me. And then I moved to Sacramento at the NPR station there, covering climate change from a state level. And now I'm at KQED. I've been here about 5 months, and now jumping into the conversation about sea level rise as another aspect of the climate emergency that I haven't covered before. And these conversations with World Affairs have been very intrinsic for that, and I'm looking forward to continuing learning about them. We're doing a bunch of stories at KQED around sea level rise. We went to East Palo Alto. We're looking at North Fair Oaks, and we're going around the Bay and other areas talking about the issues around sea level rise, right? We've had droughts, we've had wildfires, we've had heat waves, and those are all things that are happening in the moment. But there's sea level rise, which is sort of a slower disaster, which there's still time to prepare for. And so that's sort of what this conversation is about, what community members or community groups and advocates are working on. So I want to have you meet our distinguished group of Bay Area leaders mobilizing around climate issues. They're going to speak with us today about what work they're doing on sea level rise and what the rest of us can do to help out. Violet Saena, she's the director of Climate Resilient Communities, an organization which uplifts historically underrepresented communities in the peninsula. And we also have Ruth Abbe from Community Action for Sustainable Alameda. It's a coalition which mobilizes around the city's sustainability goals. And then finally, we have a youth activist also from Alameda, Caroline Choi. Caroline organizes with groups like Extinction Rebellion and Sunrise Movement Bay Area, and she's currently an undergraduate student at Harvard, so she's busy, it sounds like. Each of these individuals have become leaders in their communities in addressing the policy challenges for the Bay Area brought on by climate change for years and years. And so we're going to go there and talk about what communities are doing and talk about the issues and what's missing from the conversation a bit. And if you have questions at the end, we're gonna break out into small groups, and you'll be placed randomly in groups, and you can ask one of us, the questions you have. And if you want to be in a different group, you can let one of the moderators know. So each of you focus on climate impacts and on people and communities, the people that are most impacted by climate change. Tell me a little bit about the issues at the heart of your work and where does sea level rise fall into that? Ruth, do you want to start? You're in Alameda.
Yeah, sure. So for folks that are not familiar with Alameda, we're kind of the coast of Oakland. We're separated from Oakland by an estuary, which is man-made. And then a lot of our land is landfill, meaning that land that's been, where it has taken over the part of the bay. So some of the strategies that the City of Alameda and Community Action for a Sustainable Alameda are doing is to prioritize those areas of the bay that we're willing to give back, right? So if you can imagine the coast of Oakland, Alameda, the city will be hardening the estuary side where there is a channel between us and Oakland. That's a channel for, sea-bearing vessels and, ships to go through. But on the bay side, where we have our Alameda Beach and we have the former Naval Air Station, we will be giving up some of that land back to the bay in the forms of creating new wetlands and welcoming back the water. So it's important in Alameda that we have both a climate leadership on mitigation, meaning reducing greenhouse gas emissions that impact climate change and sea level rise, and that we are realistic about the fact that we will be facing climate change and sea level rise and preparing our communities for that. So we are supporting the city in developing those projects to educate residents about the impacts of groundwater infiltration and sea level rise, preparing our communities for that, and then prioritizing areas such as the former Naval Air Station, Alameda Point, parts of Bay Farm Island where the Oakland Airport is, that will be designated to go back to wetlands. So that's good for now.
Yeah, that's good for now. Thanks, Ruth. Caroline, you're also in Alameda. What does your work focus on around sea level rise in your area?
So I've always kind of been involved with like the youth side of things and like rallying youth and getting them to show up for like protests and climate strikes. But I'd say most recently, like I've also been working on like housing and affordability within Alameda. Ruth has actually been helping me a lot with that. And one of the issues that we're seeing come up is a lot of the houses that have already been built in Alameda are going to be in flood zones and impacted by sea level rise when it starts getting a lot worse in the future. So that's going to limit the amount of housing in Alameda. It's probably going to make some houses a lot cheaper, some houses a lot more expensive. And with, like an island that has historically kind of been primarily white and wealthy, there's all these other things coming into play with how can we make the island more racially diverse? How can we make it more sustainable? How can we make it so that the kids who graduate from high school here can actually come back and afford a house in the future? So that's a lot of the stuff that I've been working on. And that also relates to like the strikes that have been happening pre-COVID, since a lot of that is shut down due to COVID. But pre-COVID, we did a lot of climate strikes relating to sea level rise and going and talking to politicians who hopefully should stop fracking in California and doing all these things that are contributing to the rise of the climate crisis.
Thanks, Caroline. Your work around, it's really about existing inequities, right? That have like that climate change on top of it all is making it worse for people that live in these places. Violet, Saena, your work is on the other side of the bay, in, I guess, the south of there and on the other side of the bay. Tell me a little bit about what you're working on there. You've worked in East Palo Alto, but other areas. Tell me about how you're helping in the sea level rise world. You're still on mute though.
Sorry about that. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here to share our work and efforts in the communities that we serve. So climate resilient communities, we are located in Palo Alto, but we work directly and serve communities in East Palo Alto, Bellhaven of Menlo Park, and North Fair Oaks. So with the sea level rise crisis, we have done a lot of work in East Palo Alto supporting communities and residents that are more like frontline to these vulnerabilities. East Palo Alto, it's a flood-prone area community. It's also highly one of the most vulnerable cities or communities to sea level rise. What we have done in the past years is build community capacity to engage. As we all know that, you know, in communities of color, under-resourced communities, like communities that we serve, there is a need for a lot of work to build up the capacity to enable residents that are directly impacted by the impacts of sea level rise to be able not only to be part of the planning process, but also to be able to respond and prepare. So one of the main issues that we have done, I mean, one of the, you know, the main programming that we have done in the past is that we've built capacity through bringing community leaders and residents and youths together, part of a climate change community team that in fact we're able to give the power to the people to plan for and lead activities. And one of the things that we have realized in recent years is that after all the engagement we have done in these communities and understanding their priorities, a lot of the projects that need to take place now to adapt to climate change and sea level rise have to be community-led solutions. So that's something that we advocate for, and we are currently working with our communities to respond, because climate change and sea level rise is already impacting the communities that we serve.
You said something called the capacity to engage, you know, and the fact that the climate crisis is already disproportionately impacting communities of color and low-income people. You know, it's no longer being ignored, at least on paper. You know, how does equity and inclusion play into solutions your organizations are working towards when it comes to sea level rise? Violet, I know your work is really about this capacity to engage. How did, because, you know, there's diversity and inclusion and like every mantra in every organization in the world right now, but that doesn't always mean that like a community can actually partake. How did, in your communities you're working with, how did you go that extra mile to like enable communities to, first of all, understand climate change, but then get involved?
Yeah, you know, it really came down to when I started working in East Palo Alto about, I think in like 2014, and I interviewed one of the community leaders about climate change, and what she said to me really stuck with me, and kind of like that's how I'm building, that's the lens that I'm always looking into doing this work, because what she said to me was, how can we respond to something that we don't understand? Something that we don't know how high risk it is to our lives and also to our families. So what I have seen, and I'm sure it's very common everywhere, you know, when you work in communities, there's a lot of the programming that exists on the top does not trickle down. Like the residents, the people on the ground cannot access those resources and the information because there is language barrier, because you know, even the technical terms that are used in these reports or the information that's being shared, you cannot expect everyone to understand. So in the end, a lot of these people just ignore the information or not even bother to engage. What we have done in the past years is we've really gone down to where the people are, creating programs that enable them to engage. One of the programs we did in 2019 and 2020 before COVID, we implemented a community-led vulnerability adaptation pilot project that was funded by San Mateo County and also Caltrans. This project allowed CRC and Actera to really work with different focus groups, the Spanish community, the Pacific Islanders, the African American community, like creating spaces for them to be able to be open and shared how they feel about the impacts of climate change, where they are, how can they adapt. So that was one of the strategies that we did. It's really creating those spaces. Like another example is like tonight, we're having a Spanish workshop for a project partnering with Peninsula Clean Energy. It's a Spanish workshop. And what I found out yesterday, a lot of people don't have Wi-Fi and computers, even though they want to participate. So what did we do? We used the phone. They asked me to ask a CRC if we could send the link to their phone, because that's the only access that they can, turn in tonight to attend this workshop. So understanding those limitations, Ezra, the language, you have to also consider people, if you're holding workshops or meetings like in the town hall, people will not be able to go there. First, in a community like East Palo Alto, there's traffic. Very small city, but when people are off work, there is like more than an hour you'll be stuck in this very small place. So again, going back to inclusion and equity and engagement, you really have to go down, and it means time. It means you need a lot of money and funding to do that. But those are the things you have to commit to be able to allow people, the residents that are vulnerable to these climate extremes, to participate and hear their voices.
Before, Ruth, I want to ask you the same question. Before I do, Violet, what did that engaging the community on their level, in their language, what did that result in? Like, what were the results of listening to the community in that way?
Well, what we heard from those engagement, it's really the what they prioritize, right? So when we are talking about climate change, for example, we talk about the scenarios, how many feet of sea level rise, how many families, but to them, listening to them, and the concerns were, does our city have a plan? A disaster management plan? How can we get out? Where are the exits? If a disaster happens, or things like, we cannot afford the flood insurance, where can we get help with that? So it's what we heard, it's really understanding more their ability, the ability of a family, ability of the resident to respond to these threats or this risk. Do they have savings to be able to pay flood insurance, or to be able to rebuild their home if they go through this kind of disaster? Can they afford a portable cooling system to respond to heat waves? So these are kind of the things that we hear. It's really about the people and how they will be able to respond.
Ruth, when it comes to people in Alameda, the reason why people are even doing this work around sea level rise is because people live there, right? And it's all, climate change is altering life for people and earth and the other inhabitants like wildlife. But how are you engaging the people in Alameda around sea level rise work? What's going on there?
Yeah, I very much appreciate the perspective that Violet provided with regards to, community-led processes. So what we've done with Community Action for Sustainable Alameda, we are gone through leadership training with the NorCal Resilience Network and development of neighborhood-based resilience hubs. We're at the beginning stages of educating ourselves about that. We've recruited folks to the training that represent a diversity of folks involved in these issues in Alameda, and different NGOs and nonprofits and others. And we have formed a partnership with the Bay Area Maker Farm, which is a group of creative people who have leased space at the Alameda Point, our former Naval Air Station, on land that is leased by the Alameda Point Collaborative, which is a supportive housing organization that includes residents and families formerly unhoused. And so we selected that partnership and that area to be the first demonstration resilience hub. And this summer, we have recruited 2 Climate Corps fellows from the neighborhood to provide outreach and assistance to the neighborhood, to have them support, to provide a vision of what they would like to see the Resilience Hub look like.
Yeah,
Resilience
what does
hubs.
a hub look like? What what is a hub?
Yeah, so it's exactly what Violet was talking about in terms of neighborhood preparedness for climate events and other impactful events, like things like wood smoke that we've all suffered with, fire, flood, disasters, and other things. And so a resilience hub can be a physical space. It can be a trailer, a container, shipping container that supplies, emergency supplies, equipment, a solar arrays to maybe plug in your phone, ability to space for with purified air in case of vulnerable folks have are suffering from smoke events. So we want to work with the community to develop what it is that they feel like they are going to need. Maybe they feel self-sufficient with other parts of the neighborhood in terms of some of these items, and what they really want is a place to go to for a smoke event, or what they really need is a place to plug in their phone if they lose electricity or something like that. But the idea is to have it be neighborhood-based, neighborhood-focused, to tell us what they will need to, survive an earthquake, fire, flood, other things, and be more resilient. And I think the goal would be, both in terms of the physical space, to also have that social space and social interaction to bring vulnerable populations together, so that if there is a climate event or an emergency event, there's the older person who doesn't have access to a vehicle, and we know where she lives and we'll make sure she's okay. So creating that social network for to reduce vulnerabilities and to support each other.
Gotcha. Well, before I go to Caroline, what you said, communities need things, right? What are they saying they need so far in Alameda? These hubs could be everything from like one person on the corner of each block providing help, but what are you hearing from the community in Alameda that they need when it comes to like current and future climate impacts?
One thing they need absolutely is information. And I think Violet also alluded to this. People are not necessarily aware of the impacts that we'll be feeling. So for example, we can all think about 2050 and sea level rise way out into the future, but that doesn't really affect us here and now. But the other climate effects that affect us here and now are things like smoke. We will be going into smoke season very shortly, sooner than we think. And having those heat events, smoke events, cooling stations, other, places to aggregate. And we're working with the city, in addition to this concept of the Resilient Hub, to identify neighborhood spaces for cooling centers and centers for smoke events. But I think the key thing that we're getting from the community is that there is not a well-established mechanism for reaching out to people to make sure that they know they can go to the library, or that they know they can get to a school in order if there's a heat event or a smoke event. So we need to invest, the city needs to event, CASA needs to event, we need to support each other in investing in that communication channel, so that when we are facing those emergencies, we can work together to overcome them.
Thank you. Caroline, you're a young person. I wanted to have a young person on this panel because young people have different opinions about this kind of stuff, or climate change, because they're going to live with the impacts way longer than anyone else. How are you thinking about the climate crisis here in the Bay Area, Caroline? And what initiatives are you a part of at the moment when it comes to sea level rise stuff?
So I have a lot of thoughts about the climate crisis in the Bay Area, but I could kind of summarize. I think one of the things with like working in climate activism as a youth, and like I'm in college now, but I started when I was in high school. One of the biggest things was actually like having the capacity to go to protests and like having the transportation to go, having like the money to go, being able to like skip school, like that in itself is kind of a privilege if you think about it. And so when I worked in like Extinction Rebellion Youth and Sunrise Bay Area and trying to get like youth turnout to events, I think that was one of the biggest things that I saw. That also ties into like what Violet was saying about racial justice being part of climate justice, because if like you look at it, like a white teen is going to have a lot more access to resources than like a Black teen, and it's going to be harder to get like more POC out to protests. One, because if you prioritize the mental health of POC, like especially during the Black Lives Matter movement, I would say like before the Black Lives Matter movement really like kicked off last summer, a lot of climate activists were using like police during protests and having them like police the protest and filing permits, having police like lead the protests and stuff. And you definitely did not see as many POC there just because it's awkward and it's like not great for their mental health. They don't want to be there. It's uncomfortable. So that's like a lot of stuff that I think us at like Extinction Rebellion have thought about, and like we're choosing not to use police at protests. We have stuff like mutual aid, where if people need transportation, we like carpool or give out free like BART tickets so people can get to the like protest location on time. And like I know Ruth knows, but in Alameda, we tried so hard to get students excused for the climate strike on September 20th. So that like kind of worked out, kind of didn't, but there's like a lot of that involved. I think like some people think that youth kind of just do whatever they want and like it's easy for them to like slip away to all these things, but I think there's a lot of work involved there and like a lot of thinking about like how to make it accessible for everyone. And the other thing is like it's very frustrating not having like the power or the money to like influence things directly. And so like the second biggest thing is, like I was saying, mutual aid and like raising money from the community, trying to get help for people, and like having the funds to like go and get art supplies for like a protest or like go on a march or something. And I think like we have seen like just like a complete explosion of like more focus on like youth protests and youth activists. We saw like Greta Thunberg kind of like become the prominent figure. I think that was like 2 years ago almost now, but that was like really great for the climate movement. But again, there's a lot of thinking there, which was, why is it always that the media chooses like a white face to represent this movement when there's been decades of work that's been done by Black and Brown leaders in climate activism, and they never really got the spotlight on them. There weren't many articles written about them, and yeah, like there's just a lot of thinking that goes into it. And I think like as like a society on a whole, we're starting to come around to those things. I think we're being more critical about it now. But when I was first starting out, those were definitely a lot of issues that kept popping up.
You know, solutions for sea level rise around the Bay Area, it will take a regional approach, right? Because like what happens if I build a seawall around my house in San Francisco, right? The water is going to be pushed somewhere else. Ruth or Violet or Caroline, you know, why is it important to think of solutions for the entire region, not just for Alameda or not just for East Palo Alto? Explain that around your work.
Well, I can start. It's so important because we are, we are not, climate knows no boundaries in terms of the impacts. So here in Alameda, we a portion of our island is surrounded by San Leandro Bay. And so both City of San Leandro and City of Oakland are really a part of what will be the sea level rise in that area of the San Leandro Bay. And so part of the Resilience by Design project, which kind of looked to that portion of the Bay to find communication channels. It was really a collaborative approach, because all three of those cities and all of those neighborhoods that are involved are going to be impacted. And so the solutions need to be developed jointly, and not one city, as you say, can do something that's going to impact the other city. It has to be a collaboration. So that is an example where we're working regionally in our part of the Bay Area, recognizing that solution to the sea level rise impact of the San Leandro Bay is going to have to be something that all three communities and the neighborhoods that are within the directly path of that area are going to have to work collaboratively on.
Yeah, Violet, you're working, we've talked a lot because I've done some reporting with you when I first started at KQD. You're working with multiple communities now on the impacts, on the regional impacts. Why is it so important that we think of it not just as protecting East Palo Alto, but the entire region?
Well, like Ruth has alluded to, I mean, that's exactly why we work that way, because, climate change and sea level rise has no boundary. It affects everybody. But I think our main concern, which was something that was also, we established during, the Resilient by Design projects, like we were part of the South Bay Sponge in our area. And what we have looked at is that, again, back to the resources to respond to sea level rise, like things like building levees or horizontal levees that are more environmentally friendly and capable of reducing the impact. But what we have identified is that communities like cities like East Palo Alto, which is an under-resourced city compared to Palo Alto, Menlo Park, and all those other cities on the other side, if they developed their own adaptation measures without considering what they could do, their actions may impact the city of East Palo Alto. That could pose a lot more problems and raise a lot of concerns and increase vulnerability of East Palo Alto, which is already impacted by sea level rise. So planning together, collaborating is the best way to address or to respond to climate change. Building cooperation, working with those who have the resources, and then with the cities that are not able, like the others, can provide the information and what they can bring into the project. So it's really about protecting everyone, not just those who have the resources, and the have-nots are being left out. And that's where we are very concerned and focused on too.
Yeah, Caroline, your work is focused on housing a bit, and like housing around the Bay and thinking about sea level rise and climate change. Talk to me a little about your work and why you think this matters regionally.
Yeah, I mean, overall, the Bay Area just has like a terrible housing problem with like affordability, like accessibility, and like the news talks about it all the time. But it does feel like certain city governments are like lagging or kind of falling behind in actually providing those housing measures that can protect low-income communities or like more racially diverse communities from gentrification and things like sea level rise. And like I said before, like I've been working in Alameda, and historically it has been like very redlined and gentrified. And then you cross the bridge, and then right next to it is like East Oakland, and you see like homeless encampments, and there's like subsidized housing there. And it's very clear that Alameda government kind of puts a lot of money into like cleaning up streets in Alameda, whereas if you cross the bridge, it suddenly becomes obvious there's like potholes in the road, places where the city obviously is just failing to like keep the like standard of living really nice and clean for everyone there. And so I think what it comes down to is like, even if just Alameda is working on like building great sustainable housing, like they also need to work with cities like Oakland and Berkeley and across the Bay Area to make sure that the standard of living is like pretty consistent across the board, and that it's not like there's certain groups or like certain areas where it's better for people, because that's how things get gentrified, and that's how like you see racial segregation in the modern day. So
Yeah.
I think that's one of the most important things.
In my reporting, I've noticed that, there's different entities around the Bay doing things. Like Alameda's doing some stuff around sea level rise. East Palo Alto is San Francisco, on the airport. And then there's areas where like Newark and other areas where there's not a lot of work happening. Why do you think there's not like this regional system in place to put teeth to like sort of like set standards for the entire region? You two, maybe this is for Ruth and Violet who are working in this world. Why do you think we're not seeing regional teeth when it comes to sea level rise if we're already living with the impacts of the immediate impacts of climate change, like drought, wildfire, and smoke?
Right. Well, there are, of course, some regional programs that are in development. We are a part of Bay Ren, and there's also Bay Adapt, and both of those organizations are regional solutions to the collaboration problem that you're talking about. But not everybody is a part of those dialogues. I think that's the big problem, is that there are folks like, the Bay Conservation District, the airports, BART, Metropolitan Transportation Commission, a lot of these folks at these regional agencies, the ABAG, are looking at these issues and talking amongst themselves. But sometimes communities are left behind. We are also a part of the Climate Emergency Mobilization Task Force, which was spearheaded by a former council member, Cheryl Davila from Berkeley. And that group has tried to be as expansive and recruit folks from all over the Bay Area. But I know exactly what you're saying, is that we don't necessarily have people that we can call up on the city council in, I don't know, Newark or, Los Altos, or I don't know. I mean, it's not necessarily everyone knowing about it and engaging with it. And so it is our responsibility, and probably your responsibility too, as a part of the media, to make folks, this is a part of it, more aware of their opportunities to get connected and get more information. So I am aware of these regional programs and regional projects. We've been trying to get Alameda and other nearby cities involved. People do have limited capacity, right? And so I think that's the other thing is, we have, people have their jobs, they have their families. It takes time to, become an activist and work outside of you work within your community. So I think that's the other thing, is we just have to recognize that people have limited capacity. And so what do we need to do regionally to inform everybody of their role in becoming more involved? And how can we seek out elected official leadership to be a part of those regional discussions when they meet as part of those regional agencies and regional discussions on solutions, to make sure that all communities are getting well represented? I think we have work to do. We have work to do as activists to inform. And then, of course, World Affairs Council, media also have a role to make sure people are informed.
We only have about 5 minutes left before we go to group chats. What do you as activists or people, advocates in these communities need? Moving forward, you talk about how there maybe isn't regional teeth in the system, but maybe each of you, is there something that you think you need moving forward that could be really helpful?
For us, with our work, it's mostly, what we need is funding. Access to funding is one big issue that we have. A lot of funding streams are mostly for mitigation projects, but we are talking about, adaptation planning, increasing awareness, education. Very limited funding are available for community-led solutions. So if someone asks me, what do you need? I need money to increase our impact. I need money to be able to go to other communities and help them to plan for climate change.
Ruth or Caroline, you want to add anything else on that one?
I definitely agree. I would also say like, because Extinction Rebellion has tried to build up a lot of like mutual aid within communities, which is basically just like this big like pot of like money or like food or anything like that, where we can distribute it to youth that are in need, regardless of if they've been like super active in the climate space or not, just so we can like start fostering those connections better as a community. And I think like if there's a mutual aid network within like your city or your community, definitely like contribute to that, and also like help fund youth activists.
Yeah, so one of the largest questions I get all the time, or the most frequent, I should say, is like, how can we help? How can we get involved? Like, from your perspectives, you're all in different parts of the Bay and different age groups. Like, how can people get involved in your work or sea level rise work and sort of work around this?
I wanted to put a shout out again for the Climate Emergency Mobilization Task Force, because it is regional in scope and because there's a lot of interest and energy and nonprofit organizations and others, agencies, communities involved. That is a way to get involved. The website is CEMTF.org, Climate Emergency Mobilization Task Force.org. And we have a series of summits coming up this fall focused on things like fossil fuel Bay Area, transportation and infrastructure, ecological protection, all with the goal of involving both activists and community members and elected officials, regional agencies, regional officials in a dialogue about the climate crisis and opportunities for the Bay Area to work together regionally. So that is one good way to get involved. If you're in Alameda, of course, you can get in touch with me or Caroline. We're casa-alameda.org. And we would love to get more involvement at the city level in our neck of the woods.
Violet, you have anything to add to that one around how people can get involved?
Yeah, I think, I think one easy thing you can do is just look in your own community, see if there are community-based organizations that are working on this field and supporting, the disadvantaged or under-resourced families there. That's one way of getting connected and learning more about their vulnerabilities. And you will have that information, and I'm sure those who are listening here today will be able to be an advocate for those voiceless communities and residents in your own area and space.
Caroline, I want to end with you. I think I have two questions for you. It seems the youth climate movement has made a fuss, right? And that's why things have happened fast, because they've done these strikes and those kind of things. How can people get involved in the youth climate movement that you're part of?
Yeah, so I'm part of Extinction Rebellion Youth. You can look it up, and there's like a website. You can email whichever email you find on there. It'll go straight to the national team. And if there is a chapter in your area, you can definitely join, and we can like connect you to them. And if there isn't a chapter, you can make one yourself, and it's super easy because we have all the resources that you need, and we can like hop on a Zoom call and help you out. I would say right now, just because of COVID, there hasn't been like any big protests happening lately. And like that's kind of a bummer, but what we've been doing is we've actually been doing a lot of art-based like actions where we do like posters and make banners at home and put them up in areas of our city where people can see them. And we've like done stickering and some spray painting. And it's really nice just like stepping out and seeing like a banner that says like something hopeful or something that like kind of calls out the city government or the people in your community for like ignoring a certain issue. So we also have those resources, and you can always like email us and we can send those to you.
Just a last quick question for you. Maybe we can make this a short answer, but you're a young person. The three of us are gonna be older and like not be here in the future. Like, what do you think our generations don't understand about the youth climate movement that you want to clear up?
Oh, that's a really big question. I would say that I think sometimes youth activists come off as like being super pushy or like conceited sometimes. Like we seem kind of arrogant because we're like telling all these older people that we know like much more, or that like we're more educated on politics or climate change or whatever. But I think like you just have to remember that it all comes from like a very like personal place, and a lot of these activists like have either felt the effects of the climate crisis firsthand, or like there's like this feeling of sorrow that comes with like thinking about the future. Like we might think about going to college, but we don't really think about like what happens next. It's always like, I guess we'll see what happens, because we're not sure anymore, and there's a lot of uncertainty that surrounds the work that we do.
Thank you, Caroline. So thanks to Ruth and Violet for joining us in this conversation, and World Affairs for putting it on. We're going to do something different. Usually we do an open Q&A where people can just ask and we'll answer them here, but we're going to split up in different groups now. And you're going to be able to speak directly with one of us and ask us your questions. And so that'll end promptly around 1 o'clock. They might go a little bit longer than 1, but we won't come back to this main session. So you don't need to wait around once your group is done. So thank you all so much. And once again, thank you, Ruth, Violet, and Caroline, for sharing your stories and what's happening in your part of the Bay. And we'll automatically just go to the other groups now. So see you soon.